Hi there. Well, this is live TV. It's theater, not television, and we've had some technical difficulties. These things happen, don't they? So, welcome everybody. Thanks for your patience and for joining us today. My guest today is Dr. Jonathan Ward. Dr. Ward is an expert on Chinese global strategy and U.S.-China competition. I'm actually reading this from your bio. He earned his PhD in China-India relations at the University of Oxford, and his undergraduate degree is at Columbia University, where he studied Russian and Chinese languages. Dr. Ward's on-the-ground experience, and this is fascinating, in Asia includes traveling across Tibet in truck caravans, crossing the South China Sea by cargo ship, and gaining access to Communist Party diplomatic archives in Beijing, which have since been closed to the world. Dr. Ward lived and traveled globally for over a decade in China, India, Russia, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. He speaks Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and Arabic. Jonathan, it's been a minute. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jack. It's great to see you again and good to be on LinkedIn Live. First time for me.
A couple of things. I was reading from your bio, all the places you've lived. Can I give you a list of the places I've lived?
You bet.
Massachusetts and New Hampshire.
Oh, very good.
Impressive, isn't it? So
I've lived in Massachusetts too.
Oh, okay. Geez, I don't even have that on you. Wow. But I've got New Hampshire. So, and you speak 5 languages, which, is only 4 more than me. So we're pretty much even there. So, but you've got just a fascinating background, and delighted to have you on. And I definitely want to talk about your book a little bit. But first, you're sort of recently an entrepreneur.
Yes, that's been my new life. I came back from my doctoral studies in the UK in 2017 and set up a company called Atlas Organization, where we advise essentially US Fortune 500s on strategy towards China and on managing the geopolitical risks that are taking shape in the world right now as the US-China relationship sort of deteriorates. And this has massive global implications for pretty much everybody. So we've worked with some really wonderful companies to help them see this stuff more clearly, come up with plans of action, and figure out what to do. Everything's changing all around them, so we can be a resource there.
Yeah, and you're a tremendous resource. I know we were chatting before, you going crazy and doing some great work here. So kudos to you for doing that. So yeah. I know a lot of your expertise, Jonathan, is with the larger companies, rightly so. But a lot of my own connections are sort of the venture-backed, smaller entrepreneurial companies. And they may have some different struggles, right? Then they may have some bigger challenges.
Well, that's right. And that's something that we definitely want to talk about today. As you've mentioned, I'm mostly used to working with sort of large cap Fortune 500s, Fortune 100s. We get the Fortune 50 as well once in a while. But when it comes to the mid cap, sort of, let's say 9 figures, and in that zone, I think you're going to run into similar challenges here, because you're basically going to be in a world in which Chinese industrial policy, the basis for their economic expansion, their government-led economy, is all really taking shape across strategic industries identified in their policies. And it's one thing to struggle against that when you're a massive company that has certain resources. It's another to struggle with that when you're part of, in a sense, the US innovation base. So much of the innovation that's going to be required to win in this contest with China, which we'll talk about, but we're in it. We're not going back. It's not going to change. This is the real thing. We're going to need our small and medium enterprises to thrive and succeed and really be that sort of element of the economic ecosystem, the sort of national economic forest, if you will. They're going to have to thrive in order for us to be able to compete on a large scale with China. And I think they're presented with much more dangerous risks, actually, because they don't have the same resources that a large company may have. And they're also going to have certain opportunities, because the other side of this, at this point, we're going to be in a head-to-head industrial policy competition with China. Theirs is represented by something called Made in China 2025. But we've had some huge events in the past, just this month, the past couple of weeks, on the U.S. industrial policy side with the passage of the Competition and Innovation Act, which is also prioritizing strategic industries for investment by U.S. government. So hopefully this will lead to serious opportunities for small and medium enterprises in strategic industries. And at the same time, they're in danger of getting just taken out by China competition. You told me once the story of a a company in New England that had worked very hard to reach the sort of $100 million range, and they just got wiped out by IP theft from China. And I'm sure there are many other stories that we just don't hear about companies that are building, growing, trying to achieve something, but they're winding up in this sort of contest of the titans, and they can just get really badly hurt. So I think small companies and medium companies also need to be prepared for this, both the serious risks, but also the opportunities that are going to come as the U.S. Prepares to win ultimately against our adversary.
Yeah, and that company was a New Hampshire-based company, and they were thought to be sort of the next big thing in New England. They were a great clean energy technology.
Right.
They were gonna, they wanted to keep the manufacturing jobs in the area, which not a lot of companies do, and they were sort of thought they were just going to be creating thousands and thousands of jobs in the area, and 3 years later they were kind of gasping for breath. It was, the Chinese approach to capitalism is a little bit more aggressive than ours, perhaps. So,
and Jack, do you remember the piece of that story where China fit into it? I mean, what exactly happened there, if you recall?
Yeah, the company was GT Solar, and they made solar panels. Mm-hmm. And I suppose it's depending upon which side you believe. And we're going back 8 or 9 years, so my memory's not perfect. But there were sort of two parts to it that I was aware of. One of which was they simply stole some technology, and used it as their own. They were actually building certain parts of the panels over in China, and they said, "Hey, we can do this better." So they started doing it under their own brand. And then we had these strange laws where the American company was importing the components to make the technology, and those had large tariffs on them. However, China was exporting the entire thing to the U.S., and because that product was a clean energy product, the tariffs were gone. So we were taxing our own company into a competitive advantage. And they had, the senators in New Hampshire, I forget who they were at the time, but, they were influential. They were speaking up and trying to get things changed, and just couldn't get it done. So.
Right, and clean tech is going to be at the heart of this competition with China. I mean, they're going to be able to roll out industrial policies that reduce the costs, that sort of control supply chains. I mean, they're gearing up for that. We're already seeing their electric vehicles go global. I mean, our own, you've got people like Warren Buffett investing in Chinese electric vehicles. So, a lot of aspects of this interconnectedness of the U.S. and China, which is not sustainable in the long run. I promise you, that's just not going to remain the case. But right now, I mean, we're really our own companies are basically in an arms race against ourselves because we're funding the adversary as the adversary builds industrial policies that are designed to dominate strategic sectors. And clean tech's a great example, but I also wanted to just go through, just for the audience here, what goes into this picture. I mean, here are at Atlas, we've got it all worked out, basically how this whole picture fits together, where different companies fit into it. I mean, it's something we do with our clients on a regular basis. I mean, what it means for industrial policy from China to present new strategic risks. But the key thing is to understand the industries that are involved. I mean, the Made in China 2025, I mean, they've taken the name card off that, but the industrial policy is pretty, it dates back way before it was officially released, and it's still essentially effective. But, it's new energy vehicles, next generation ICT, biotech, new materials, aerospace, ocean engineering and high-tech ships, railway, robotics, power equipment, and agricultural machinery. So, if you're anywhere on that list, you've got to understand that you're going to be in the eye of the storm when it comes to what China's trying to achieve with policies that we don't do over here. And then at the same time, you're also going to be in a place where the U.S. Is going to be trying to protect some of this. I mean, there's overlap. So if you take the Innovation and Competition Act, which just passed in the Senate today, here's the list. Here's what the key technologies are on this list: artificial intelligence, semiconductors, quantum computing, robotics, automation, disaster prevention, advanced communications technology, biotech, data storage, cybersecurity, advanced energy, batteries, and industrial efficiency, and advanced materials. So you can see the overlap with about 5 or 6 of those. And that's really the Venn diagram that a lot of the important innovation of the future, a lot of the key foundations for our own economic security are going to be fought sort of in the where these two industrial policies intersect. And you also had another thing that came out that was very important, which was the results of the 100-day supply chain review, ordered by President Biden, where he basically had a bunch of the major government agencies go out and review supply chain risks and vulnerabilities. And this included high-tech batteries, basically advanced batteries, defense industrial base, pharmaceuticals, really our entire a lot of the things that matters. And I think what this is, in a certain sense, is a stand-in for the problem of economic integration with China. And I think that's the thing that every entrepreneur needs to understand, every business leader, every CFO, I mean, anybody that's charting a future as an enterprise. Really the experiment that's just failed under everybody's feet has been the US integration with China. And unfortunately, I think there are many voices, in Wall Street, which presents its own issues for, business leaders and entrepreneurs, but that are still promoting that integration and sort of advocating for it. But fundamentally, for national security reasons, it's been a failure. And Washington at this point is just really ramping up, action on this subject. So I think that's really the new world that businesses are in. And you have to make your strategy as a company based on how that's going to play out, how the U.S.-China competition is going to play out. So it should be, it's not an ancillary thing anymore. It's not sort of geopolitical risk. Let's put that in the risk section. It should be at the heart of what you're doing. You've got to have a plan.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. Stepping back, the industries you named, something you said. I used to sort of think that the China threat was, several years down the road, but that was probably true several years ago. But these are imminent. These are the current technologies, right? I mean, life sciences, I think you said automation, artificial intelligence. This is the real world today, right? This battle is being fought today. We're no longer battling for supremacy 10, 15 years from now. We're battling for it for the present and immediate future, right?
Well, Jack, I think that's right. Because what it really fundamentally is, it's a battle for the future. But it's a battle for the future that's being fought now, and it's being fought yesterday. I mean, it's something where I wrote Vision of Victory because I was very concerned that, I've been studying the rise of China since I was 22, hitchhiking around Tibet and all of that, and getting a real sense of what was, what was to be, what was concerning about the place, to put it politely. And basically,
I was a bouncer at a bar in Faneuil Hall while you were going around Tibet. So, first quarter of a century of our lives are a little bit different, it seems, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, I guess I really went out to see what was going on, and it was sort of an extreme choice in certain ways, but yeah, it wound up with some insights on this stuff. But it was I thought we were never going to wake up. I didn't know that we'd get it. I mean, we were deep in this engagement policy. I mean, everybody talking about China was talking about economic growth and opportunity, and I was just piecing together aspects of their policies and strategies. I mean, my work at Oxford, my work advising the U.S. Defense Department, and certainly my travels in country all contributed to that. And but we've come such a long way in the last couple years. I think jettisoning the engagement at all costs strategy. And I think what business leaders and entrepreneurs need to remember is that, their opportunities in China and their sort of integration in China over the past 25 years was enabled entirely by US grand strategy, by something that exists above the level of sort of business decision making. It was a choice to engage with a communist country as, essentially a trading partner and supply chain base, and in the hopes that it would lead to stability in international order. And that's at this point just widely recognized to be a failure. So,
well, even Napoleon Bonaparte famously said, "Leave China alone," right?
Right. If you wake them up, then they'll shake the world.
Hey, some host I am, right? I forgot to mention, and you referenced it, but you do have a outstanding book.
Oh, thank you.
China's Vision of Victory, and I got my copy on Amazon. I assume there are other outlets for it as well. But one of my questions, I was going to ask you what possessed to write the book, but clearly you've covered that a little bit. But anything else along your journey that kind of was the motivation and what you're hoping to get out of authoring an impressive book, to say the least?
Well, thanks, Jack. No, I mean, it's, the goal here was to create a sort of definitive handbook to Chinese grand strategy, just something that anyone can pick up and read. It was read by cabinet members. It's been read by people throughout the Defense Department, throughout the US government, increasingly in the business world and finance world, and also by all kinds of citizens across the country and around the world. So I wanted to just put on paper all the primary documents, all the key pieces of what China's leaders are trying to achieve in their own words. It's not really an opinion piece. It's more, let's put the documents in front of you so you can understand it yourselves. And it touches everything from space to undersea to Africa to Asia to military policy to individual corporations. It's the whole picture. And to put that together so that anyone can go and learn what we're up against in the words of the adversary. I mean, that was the goal, and it was essentially achieved in that book. And for it to continue to be read at this point, especially in the business community, would be my goal, because the thing that I learned over the course of all of this was I focused on so many different aspects of China over my sort of years as a student of China and all of that, and everything from the modern history to military strategy to industrial policy. But I really believe that this contest with China will be won or lost in the economic domain. If China becomes the world's leading economy, the largest economy, they're going to be capable of things that we can't defend against. And they haven't done that yet. And I think way too many strategists in Washington are at least until recently, willing to imagine a world in which China is the biggest economy, is the dominant economy, and to try to defend against that, to try to preserve US national and economic security in such a world. I don't believe you can do that. I think that if they actually wind up achieving their economic vision, the world is theirs. And the first thing is we have to prevent that. We have to make sure that we are and remain the world's largest and most dynamic economy, which sounds very challenging when you think about the fact that we're 340 million people and China is 1.4 billion, and their leaders see it that way. They say that, basically because of China's enormous population, they will come to dominate the world economy and international system and all of that. I mean, that's been true since Mao Zedong. They've always seen it that way. But we're in that very tough contest, and it's going to have to be innovation and entrepreneurship that I think carry the day. I mean, it's America Inc. versus China Inc. And, I think we're not yet assembled as a national team, and we still have a lot of illusions about China in the business community and especially in the investment community, which can profit off essentially the pure growth of China. It's not just the China market. It's, financing of Chinese corporations is possible for Wall Street. So I think that has to be dealt with. But ultimately, we want to win this economic contest because if we don't, then the chances of us, prevailing in sort of phase 2 and 3 of Chinese grand strategy are very slim. I mean, once a sort of consolidated Chinese super economy turns into a military that can't be beaten and a global sort of spheres of influence that they are already building, that's it. I mean, you're talking about an empire that's run from Beijing that. I think that's how they see their own vision of the 21st century. So in an odd way, it falls to our business leaders and entrepreneurs to just kick the U.S. economy into high gear, make sure that we're not losing everything to our adversary, and to win in that domain so that our country will ultimately come out of this.
Yeah, I know they've been closing the gap forever, and COVID probably closed the gap a little bit more. But based on current projections, when are they likely to achieve economic equality?
Well, it's a great question, because the date keeps moving forward in a lot of documents, right? I mean, when I wrote the book, they were X percentage. I think they were 65. I remember when I was writing the book, I'd started my first draft, they were 60% of the U.S. economy, and by the publication date, I had to adjust that upwards, because it's happening in real time. But really, COVID-19 has been a real catalyst for them to gain on us, at least thus far, if today's numbers are any guide. And earlier this year, you saw the Wall Street Journal and others sort of quoting economists saying that the time frame for China to move and sort of reach parity with the US economy in real terms was headed up to 2028, 2026. It used to be a sort of 2030s type thing. And now you have people revising that to the 2020s. And on the other side of that is the Communist Party's sort of many, semi-official statements, and sort of party scholars and people like that are all talking about how this has cemented our position in the world economy and, put us in a great strategic position. So they literally look at the COVID pandemic as something that's been, an advantage to them in their contest with the United States. It's pretty awful.
Yeah, it's crazy because, in the US, there are companies that benefited from it. but we're Uber Eats and companies like that, right? But they're apologetic for it. And they certainly wouldn't have wished for it, right? I mean, they were well positioned for what the economy needed. But it sounds like they're actually almost thinking it as a positive development.
Well, there's a whole lot of that in on paper that has been said. So yes, I mean, I think that's they see it as turning crisis into opportunity and all these other unfortunate points of view. But it's also why China's relationship at this point, I mean, if we step outside the United States for a little bit and look at China's relationship with the world, I mean, it's deteriorated quite a bit over the past year. And that's everything from economic coercion to Australia to threats of war with Taiwan to, actually killing Indian troops in the Himalayas last summer. To sanctioning members of European Parliament. And I mean, they're really taking on everybody in a certain sense. And the Russia-China relationship seems to be flourishing, but they do have their enablers and partners. But generally speaking, and at this point, China is confronting the West, confronting Asia, confronting India, confronting America. I mean, their relationships with the world's two most important democracies. I mean, the United States and India have essentially deteriorated to near collapse. So this is, and it's all in there. It's all in the ethos that comes from the founding of the People's Republic of China, and now we're going to reach the centennial of the founding of the Communist Party, and this year we're there already. But this idea that China is sort of taking on the world is, I think, very much at the heart of their narrative, as at the Communist Party's narrative for its country. So that's what we're dealing with, and I think that it's going to be a big challenge that we're just waking up to.
You paint an intimidating picture, I think is fair to say, Jonathan. A couple of things. If folks are listening, we are actually live. So if you have any questions for Jonathan, if you type them into the comments box, we will be able to see them and respond in real time to you. But I have a few questions for you, if I may. And, keep in mind, the background's fantastic. But, most of my audience are CFOs and folks like that who, they're running their business. Right. And hopefully you've motivated them to ask some of the questions, themselves. And the first, business leader, American business leader, how should they be positioning themselves in respect to the Chinese market? Because, I've always thought tremendous opportunities, right? If you can suddenly sell to 1.4 billion people, that's a beautiful thing, right? But so how can we position ourselves within the Chinese markets?
Well, here's the issue, Jack. I mean, so I wrote something for CFO Magazine a few years ago, which we should probably share with everybody. Maybe we can put that in a link or something here. But made several. This was 2018, before it was just everybody discussing China all the time. And 3 recommendations to understand that China is not simply a market; it's a strategic competitor. I mean, it's really an understanding situation. Also, that C-suite leaders have to understand the role that they play in U.S. national security, because this is an economic contest, and also that strategy at the C-suite level is going to be more and more to do with geopolitics. So long-term thinking is going to be essential. And I think we've got to get over this sort of, myth of the China market. I mean, yes, it's worked out for a lot of places, but they haven't necessarily paid the cost yet. Or they have paid the cost in terms of intellectual property, but they haven't yet seen that translate into full-bore Chinese competitors that are going to, come after them in global markets. But, the billion customer concept, which of course I think has been very influential in the past 20 years and led to some success. It's still, I think, a story that's only half told, because if you look at the travails of the NBA or H&M or just all kinds of companies that are being increasingly forced to sort of take the side of the party on human rights issues, on things like this. I mean, it's not a perfect market. I mean, you're going to wind up in a world in which many values are going to be compromised, being tied to slave labor in Xinjiang or human rights atrocities. I mean, these are all just sort of the features of being part of that place. And at the same time, there's IP theft. I mean, anything that's in China has probably already been taken. And how is that going to be repurposed when you put massive government guidance funds and industrial policies behind that? I mean, it's going to be a global contest. So I think the first thing is, when I look at it this way, I mean, when I talk to, business executives or business leaders, and they say, oh, this is very interesting, let me take you to my China team, I realize that they don't understand the problem. This problem isn't about your China team. This problem needs to happen at the C-suite and the board. It's a strategic question. The only balancing to the issues posed by China is going to be about thinking globally. So you're going to have a global strategy for emerging markets. You're going to have a global strategy for basically working within the OECD, i.e. US, Europe, Japan, that's going to keep you a market leader even as you wind up in this contested space. And you better make sure that China is not one of the centerpieces of your long-term strategy. For example, let's say that we wind up in military conflict over Taiwan. I mean, certainly that's an issue now that the Pentagon is taking seriously, the Pacific Command is taking seriously, and this is not a joke. The leader of PACOM said that it could happen within the next 6 years. That may be very optimistic. What's your strategy then? I mean, at that point, I mean, have you built in your supply chains in China? Is the market just an essential piece of your growth? Because if it is, far fewer people are going to care, I think, about individual companies at the point in which we have that kind of conflict going on. And in the meantime, U.S. government is looking, I think, to pull supply chains back from China, to close off investment and IP transfer, and ultimately to make our own country more competitive. So if you're not, I think, in the mainstream of those dynamics, you're not really working on a future that exists. So the future in which the China market is just where you want to be. I mean, I think that really needs to be critiqued in an organization, and you need to have contingency plans, and ideally start making sure that you don't depend on it, that you don't require the China market at all costs. And I think too few companies have gone through those sorts of exercises.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the NBA. And so let's sort of, chat about that a little bit, because I think 80% of us think we're experts on sports, right? Living in Boston, I'm surprised how many people think that they could manage the Red Sox or the Patriots better than the incumbents in the role. But, if your decision, how would you advise the NBA to proceed? Because obviously it's a huge television market, I would think, right? And whatnot, but it's fraught with some danger too, right?
Yeah. So sports is not an industry I've worked in, but I think the first thing is looking at their next 5 to 10 years and just where does China fit in? I mean, what do you think you're doing now? How can you change that? Can you avoid that? What if you wind up making choices that or being asked to do things that you really can't do as an American cultural institution, which the NBA certainly is? At what point is, we saw this, I think the apparel industry has been an interesting example where the Communist Party basically set up this campaign of having Chinese consumers say, they took H&M off the internet. They had all kinds of consumers on the internet saying that Xinjiang cotton, which is the center of a genocide at this point, must be supported, and Western companies should support that. And if you wind up in a situation like that where you're forced to choose sides over issues that just can't be reconciled from a perspective of human rights and values, which does matter in a whole lot of the world, even if the Communist Party suppresses that in China, how are you going to deal with that? So I think having a plan, realizing that this road is not just going to be a simple path to market, but a market that could get very ugly. How important is that? I mean, is that an artery in your global strategy, or is it just a vein? I mean, you don't want this to be a main artery. So I think for the NBA, it begins with a strategy review to understand where you think you're headed over the next 5 to 10 years, and how that could go wrong, and what you have in place to make sure that if things go wrong, you're not, up the creek.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. We have our first audience question, and it's from Nazish Motin. And Nazish asks, can you share more thoughts on how the West can displace China? You mentioned a need to assemble as a national team. Where can they start? Yeah, well, thanks, Nazish. It's a very important question. I mean, my 3 recommendations in China's Vision of Victory, and I'm very happy to see that these are actually, at least 2 of them are coming to fruition. I said, 1, remain the world's largest economy. 2, unite the democracies. And 3, maintain deterrence in the Pacific. Deterrence in the Pacific, I mean, that's obviously a huge focus. That's really happening. The Biden administration, I think, has been very strong with its rhetoric about democracies and working towards that. So I think this is something that Biden is doing brilliantly, really, in the global diplomacy. I mean, we've got to engage Europe. And then, number 1, which I think relies more on board CEOs and entrepreneurs and innovators, that one is still to be seen, and that's a long road. But bringing the democracies together, I think, is first of all, what you really need is a global coalition, and I think that this emerges out of the Second World War and the Cold War, where you basically had Europe and Asia as totally separate spheres. So we basically fought 2 separate theaters.
in the Second World War, and then the Cold War evolved to Russia on one hand and China on the other hand. I mean, look how the same characters are back now. But we never really had an integrated strategy, as far as I can tell. And I think, I say this as somebody who did my doctorate in the UK as an expert on China and India, an American, Asia specialist in Britain. And, I just, it was so separate to see, European security was European security and Asian security was Asian security. And I think what you really want is for Europe to be just as involved in the problems of the Pacific as the Pacific is. At this point, you really have the Quad is coming together with India, Japan, and Australia. But how do you get Britain and France involved? How do you get Germany more focused on the Pacific? How do you bring the whole picture together so that ultimately it's a global coalition and not a set of regional coalitions? And I think the other thing is you have to, on one hand, that's going to involve more interoperability, more sort of defense initiatives. But the economic side is going to be incredibly important. Why do we have to base our supply chains in an adversary country? We shouldn't do that. We should be looking for alternative supply chains. India could be very important in a manufacturing future that's more friendly to the democracies, for example. And how do you really have a vision of a new world economy where the democracies are, the markets we want to be in, the basis of manufacturing and supply, and that will have to be worked on. Additive manufacturing is going to be incredibly important. And then ultimately in which our aggregate economic power just can't be beat and our innovation capability can't be beat. So that's going to require a great deal of diplomacy initially. And I think that's fortunately what the current administration seems to be focused on.
Yeah, he's like him or love him. That certainly is a strength of President Biden, is it not? So can you clarify? And by the way, just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions for Jonathan, we will address them in real time. So one thing that has always confused me and perhaps other people, but even if I'm the only one who doesn't know this, but can you explain a little bit, how is China supporting like Chinese private companies versus state-owned companies? And is that even a real designation, or is it just something that we imagine as Americans?
It's a great question, because the way I look at it is they're basically state-owned and state-backed companies at a certain point. And I think Alibaba has been sort of the popular example where one realizes that if you get to a certain point, the Communist Party gets very interested in your future. And, we've seen the level of influence that they actually have over their private entrepreneurs, especially if they become successful in a way that really can, improve the capability of China's tech or particular national industries that matter to them. So I think at a certain point that line gets erased, and it gets erased if something becomes significant enough. As somebody described it to me, you have a whole lot of private activity going on at a certain level of the pyramid, but once the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger, at that point, that's when the government takes its most serious interest. And on the other hand, you also have, this was taking shape, even in pretty recent years before, there's been a much more serious party consolidation in the last 12 to 18 months, particularly in the tech sector. But even before that, you had party members being put on boards. There's this entire compact between the party and the private entrepreneur, which said, look, we're going to let people thrive, do business, but as long as we remain in control. And they just had various mechanisms of dealing with that. But I think at this point, the fact that they want to indigenize their key industries, make sure that they're technological and innovation leaders, means that their role in, certainly the state-owned sector is absolute, but their role in the private sector, it's really, I think that line is blurry at best, but gone in many ways.
It might be a distinction without a difference at this point, it sounds like.
I think so. I think, in a way in China, there isn't really a B2B, there's really a B2G. And that's going to present a lot of problems, I think, for our own companies and their China strategies, because, if you're an OEM and let's say your end users are certain, are basically large companies that may be linked to the military through civil military fusion. That's happening in the railway sector, that's happening in logistics, it's happening in things that we don't even think of as strategic. And I think that, part of the issue here is that we have a very different sort of definition, I think a working definition of strategy than, let's say, the Communist Party does. Theirs is much more comprehensive. When you look at strategic industries in China, you're talking about everything from obviously things like ICT with Huawei, but also things like shipbuilding and electric vehicles. And they have, strategies for food security and energy security and all of this. And, the party state is going to manage all of that to the point at which it has, it's able to build the vision it has of the future. So what gets left out of that, I think, is sort of less significant than what's included. Whereas we tend to look at, the private sector versus the government are really and truly separate spheres. Though I do think that's going to start to change because of the nature of this contest. I mean, we're just going to have to have.
I'm sorry, finish up.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to. So, Jonathan Wood joins the presidential administration. How do you advise the president? How can the U.S. government, what active role should they take with American corporations? Because in theory, we're free enterprise and the government shouldn't do anything. On the other hand, we all know that's kind of hogwash, right? I mean, if we doubted it before, we certainly don't have much doubt about it. If we believed that before, we certainly don't anymore. But so how do we get involved and help our companies without, being like them, really? Right?
Well, it goes both ways, Jack, and it's a great question. I mean, one, I would have tons and tons of CEO councils. I think the president and the CEO should be meeting all the time and on these questions and making sure that we have a shared understanding of what's going on here. And this is a little bit of a more, maybe this is not quite the mechanical side of it, but I think it'd be very, very wonderful to see, patriotism become a real thing among America's CEOs and business leaders. I mean, how many people are really willing to speak out on the China issue? How many people are really willing to talk about the future of the United States in our geopolitical contest? So few. I mean, I can count it on two hands, honestly. I've tried to make that list a dozen times.
Yeah, I couldn't name any, but
none. No,
this is what you do for a living. So
no, it's very, very minimal. I mean, I think Mark Cuban said a few good things. I think Larry Ellison said a few good things. But it's it's one or two hands, and I think
back to Lee Iacocca, right? I mean, that I remember.
Sure, yeah,
right, so,
right. No, exactly, and we've got to do that again. I mean, and the problem has been this infatuation with the China market has really just, I think, created a very schism in the American spirit where we just can't do the right thing for our country as business leaders, and I think we have to get over that. See it for what it is, and realize that the real future is going to be building America and building America into the kind of thing it needs to be to win this contest, which is going to be, we're going to have to be an industrial powerhouse. We're going to have to rebuild our manufacturing. We're going to have to secure our supply chains. We're going to have to absolutely win in every major market worldwide, with or without China. And, that could be, and we're going to have to innovate like we've never innovated before. I mean, there's this wonderful guy at IBM named Dario Gil, who I think, somebody give him like as much money as he can handle. I mean, this guy is talking about different industries that we haven't even invented yet. And the potential for innovation, to actually create through basic science, just new industries entirely. So, we have this, I think, focusing on the future, realizing that we're in a contest that can be wind at our back if we play it in the right way. I mean, we're going to, in China's vision of victory, I compared this to the space race. I was like, the kind of contest you want between the US and China is not a shootout in the Pacific. It's the space race. It's who can build the best, who can actually go and seize the next frontier.
Sure. If someone in a fist fight, you tip your hat and you applaud them and you get them next time, right? But that's kind of not what's happening here.
Right, and you know what? And we're also talking about a place that's carrying out a genocide and building a military that's designed for conflict with us. So this is a very polite way of handling that. But I do think that the fundamental thing is going to be about our vision for the future. I think we don't have one yet. And the difference between their system and ours, as I see it, is it's not that we have a different game to play per se. I mean, we're competing for the same technologies, the same industries, the same military advantages, the same global geographies, but we're going to do this, not as a command economy or as a sort of government-led thing, but what you really need is the empowerment of the individual business leader and entrepreneur and citizen, because that's what we're made up of, to go out and understand what we're dealing with and, throw their own best thinking and best action at this problem. Because once you get everybody firing on all cylinders to deal with this problem, how do you get our companies asking themselves, look, one, how do I remain the market leader? How do I create game-changing innovations? And how do I do this in a world where I understand the geopolitical contours, where it's not going to be basing myself in China that wins. It's going to be about building the future for the United States and our fellow democracies. That's the winning ticket, and that's what we need to be focused on. And right now, I think we have this cognitive dissonance, this multinational corporation thing that was basically just a feature of U.S. victory in the Cold War. It's not realistic. I mean, at this point, it's, as Biden likes to say, and this is my favorite thing about him, he keeps talking about democracies and autocracies. I mean, I've been saying that too. It's like, this every generation we get democracies versus dictatorships. We have to go through this democracies versus dictatorship thing. And the thing that we've got now is if we can win this in the economic domain, I think we can prevent the worst sort of, possibilities here. But if we can't, we're going to head into a much, potentially a very brutal and difficult world that we don't want to be in. So I do think that the real victory here is probably in the hands of the of business leaders. I had this article that I was sort of drafting and never really finished, but just if George F. Kennan, essentially the Sovietologist that brought us containment, which was the winning strategy in the Cold War, like if he were alive today with the same understanding of the China contest that he had of the Soviet contest, he would address his long telegram to America's business leaders, because they're the ones that have to be brought on side, or we're not going to win. And the government right now is doing everything it can. I mean, Washington, I think, is really alive with this contest and with what it takes to win. But our business leaders just aren't involved. They're not even on the field yet. And that's what we need to win. And we also need Wall Street to just, I mean, come on, guys. Like China's not it.
Everybody I'm connected to on LinkedIn is a business leader and not a political type. Jonathan has given you the challenge, and we're all counting on you to make it so. I have one final question, but if the audience has any more, you have a few minutes, Jonathan, if they do have some.
Yeah, I do. No, let's.
Yeah, Najis said, good question. I assume she meant one of my questions, not her own, but her question actually was outstanding. So, but, I remember in the 80s, there was, I'll say maybe paranoia is too strong, but Americans were very concerned about espionage from Japan. And, it turned out that wasn't maybe the threat that we perceived it was.
Sure.
But China, they've raised espionage levels, to an art form, right? Can a little insight into that, how that's hurting American companies and productivity and innovation?
Sure, and it's a fitting question, especially because we've, with the, Competitiveness and Innovation Act, we've basically had this is the biggest industrial policy since the 1980s. So fitting time to talk of this. But, there are some key differences here. One, just in the situation, which was, Japan was a treaty ally of the United States. It was going through an industrial policy that we ultimately fought back against. Microprocessors and semiconductors was a key arena in that, which if we hadn't done anything, who knows what would have happened? It might not have been good. So many of those actions, I think, are, seem quite intelligent in retrospect. But the espionage side, that's something that's got to be fundamentally different. We've had multiple government leaders talk about, China's industrial espionage has been the biggest, theft and transfer of wealth in human history. It's worked out to a very, yes, the science is a good way to put it. There are just dozens of little mechanisms that they use to do this. The breaches are pretty bad when they happen. Huawei's got plenty of stories on that, and they're in a lot of different industries. You've got some good examples there, but I think the biggest difference is that it feeds into a multi-sector government-led strategy, which I don't think was the case in Japan. Now, I'm not really a specialist on that, but back then you're talking about more of a corporate interest type situation where, let's say, individual corporations or even maybe sectors are collaborating a little bit. But here you're talking about a central government with a very clear, very detailed strategy for industrial dominance, and state actors carrying out these activities in an integrated world, and then potentially transferring them to their companies for all sorts of advantages. So it's just on a much larger scale, and you're also talking about a strategic competitor that civil military fusion or military civil fusion is another subject we haven't even touched on today, really. But the transfer of innovation in the private sector to the Chinese military so that they can close the gaps with the US and win a war against the US. That's the strategy there. So you wind up with civilian innovation potentially reaching the Chinese military in ways that are designed for a war effort against us. That was not Japan in the 80s. So much more.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Japan in the 80s, and I'm at least a year or two older than you. But I remember, even going to the 70s, there was sort of, paranoia is probably not the right word, but like the auto industry, Detroit, one of the great American cities. And, it was a matter of national pride that we had such great cars. And all of a sudden, with Honda and Toyota and Nissan and a few others, all of a sudden Japan had these, candidly back then, superior cars to what American companies were reproducing at great value. And it was a threatening thing to us because it was kind of new to us, right? We never thought that we could possibly lose the auto industry. To Detroit's credit, I mean, American made cars now are well built, and we probably learned as much from Japan as they did from us. But you're right, this is very different.
It's on a totally different scale.
They're doing things better than us. And if a company was stealing, it was the company that was stealing. It wasn't because the government was. So cool. Well, I think that's great. I do want to thank you both for your time today and, for putting up with our technical difficulties at the beginning. The book, again, is China's Vision of Victory. And Jonathan, I know you're on LinkedIn. Are you on Twitter? Can people follow you there? Or do you have a blog or anything?
Sure. I guess Twitter, I'm on Twitter. I use LinkedIn more, but yes, it's Jonathan D.T. Ward on Twitter.
Okay.
And then, you can visit my website for more info about the book and all the rest of it.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm on Twitter. I tweeted a lot when the TV show Breaking Bad was on, but since then it's been pretty minimal. I haven't really mastered the Twitter thing yet. But Jonathan, this was great. Appreciate your insights. Great to see you. I hope you have a great summer. And now that COVID's over, soon we'll actually meet in person, I hope.
We certainly will. Well, Jack, great to see you again. And yeah, thanks for hosting me. And thanks to anyone who stopped by to watch our conversation.